Hello everyone and welcome to my place-based learning presentation for my place visit. But before we get started, I did want to do a land acknowledgement. So I would like to acknowledge that I am learning, creating, and living in Stseq.qi'qen, the unceded, occupied traditional lands of the Stseq'en peoples. I respect and give thanks to all my relations on this territory for the teachings and experiences I will explore in this presentation, in particular to the Tecumlips to Stseq'en and Stseq.qi'qen Indian band. So I chose to do my place visit at Balancing Rock, which I believe is pronounced Stseq.qi'qen. So here are some pictures for you to see what it looks like. So it is located on Kamloops Lake towards Savannah. And there's a picture looking out towards Kamloops, a picture of me with the rock, and then a picture from underneath the rock. So to give you some context, it is a sense of place for the Stseq'en people. It is a coyote rock, which is a boundary marker used to determine the reach of the Stseq'en or the Stseq'en lands, and it is sometimes connected to stories of shapeshifters or important events. So this place is a war story. It was a story of a war between the Stseq'en and the Stseq. When the Stseq tried to invade the Stseq'en lands, there was a war fought at this place, and when the Stseq'en won the war, the Stseqs challenged them to a competition to put the heavy boulder on top of the pillar, and whoever was able to put the boulder on top of the pillar won the land for their people. And the Stseq'en warrior won for his people, so that is why it's an important place, and it kind of marks the boundaries on Kamloops Lake there for us. So I believe that it's a place of learning in more ways than one. So the Balancing Rock can be a place of learning in itself. Scientifically, we can look at how it was created and what kind of rock it is. We can also look at the landforms around it and see if we can get any knowledge from that. But I also believe that it always has been a place of learning. I believe that the Stseq'en warriors learned lessons that day, and I believe that the Stseq warriors learned lessons that day as well. So I think that it's an interesting connection, that it's a place of learning and of teaching. So I chose to plan my field trip for a grade 3 class. So the plan would be to have the students start by observing the protocols of being on the land and observing protocols of being in nature and what that would entail and how they are supposed to treat the land when they explore and visit sacred places like this. Next, on the hike, I would explicitly teach Stseq.qi'qen. So I would be teaching plants, trees, animals, and landforms. And then another element of the field trip would be having the students listen to the story of Balancing Rock while they were there observing it in real time. Another element of this field trip would be connecting all of our learning to the First Peoples principles of learning and our histories as Stseq'en people, which would include the Stseq'en cultures, our traditions, and our ways of knowing, especially in a place like Balancing Rock, which would have different ways of knowing than other people might think. And some activities that I would choose to do on this field trip would be a Stseq.qi'qen scavenger hunt, which I would allow the students to do probably after I had given them the story and they were able to run around within the boundaries that I set on a field trip while being supervised to find maybe specific plants or an insect, a rock, maybe the lake even itself. So this would include some plant identification, and then an activity that I had post field trip would be retelling the story of Balancing Rock in some form, whether that be through a play, through another story, through a song, through a poem, through an art piece. Just having the students reflect on their time in that place and retell the story. So some field trip considerations that I wanted to point out for this field trip in particular were for safety, supervision, travel, and differentiated instruction. So I just wanted to point out that it is a hike. It's not a difficult hike, but you will be out in nature, and by being out in nature with children, that automatically has some safety issues that come up. And there is cactus on the hike, and that seems to be a bit of a safety concern for some. Another consideration would be having adequate supervision, making sure that you outlined the boundaries for the students of where they were allowed to go, and then constantly observing all of your students. Traveling to and from the site might be something to consider if you have a budget for a bus or how long it might take, if you could maybe travel with another class or do a whole school field trip. That might help the ability for your school to do a field trip like this. And then another consideration I wanted to have was just for differentiated instruction, to be aware that some of the activities and directions, boundaries, supervisions, travel accommodations might have to be altered for some of your students depending on their needs. And also providing an opportunity for parent chaperone or parent involvement in a field trip like this that's out on the land. So along with the field trip, I wanted to think about how I might further my connections for these place-based teachings. Some ways that I might do that would be by reading or observing the story in Stseq.qi'qen. I think that this field trip would be really easily connected to a unit of learning I did this term, connected to oral storytelling and origin stories. I also think that this field trip would be really easily connected to interdisciplinary studies with science, English language arts, fine arts, and physical and health education. I think that you could also do compare and contrast. So comparing oral versus written stories, traditional borders versus modern borders, Indigenous knowledge versus Western knowledge. And I'm sure that there's many other things that you could do with this as well. These were just some ideas I came up with. So, and then it does connect to the BC curriculum. I will outline a few connections that I made here for grade 3 social studies. So the curricular competencies I chose were for significance and perspective. So explaining why people, events, or places are significant to various individuals or groups, the Stseq.qi'qen, and explain why people's beliefs, values, worldviews, experiences, and roles give them different perspectives on people, places, issues, or events. So the big idea I chose to connect this field trip to was Indigenous knowledge is passed down through oral history, traditions, and collective memory. And these are just some content points that I chose to connect to the grade 3 social studies curriculum. Oral history, traditional stories, and artifacts as evidence about First Peoples cultures, relationship between humans and the environment, and cultural characteristics and ways of life of local peoples. So for the First Peoples principles of learning, I did choose 2 because I thought that they both worked really well. Learning is embedded in memory, history, and story. And learning is holistic, reflective, experiential, and relational, focused on connectedness, on reciprocal relationships, and a sense of place. So these are my resources for you. So that's it. Stseq.qi'qen. Thank you all very much for listening today. I hope you enjoyed my presentation.